so I'll just plug in. Okay, let's start at the very beginning. The whole issue of how we treat people kind of came after the Second World War and the various atrocities that went on during that time. There's a thing called the Nuremberg Code, which was set up with these expectations, things like if you involve a person in an experiment of any sort, they should always be able to end it. Their consent should be voluntary, and you should essentially get it. What you do to a person to justify the ends or the output. You should protect your participants from harm as much as possible during the study, and yes, so the benefit should outweigh the cost. So the Nuremberg Code was set up really to as a basis from which all ethics have followed. Okay, so let me talk. That was just after the Second World War. Now, much more recently, it's very hard sometimes to stick to these codes. Now, in psychologists, where you will know, presume you'll know about Guantanamo Bay, yeah, and Abu Ghraib, right? Well, psychologists were involved in questioning the prisoners at these places. Now, of course, as a psychologist, you'll know that sometimes people are quote tortured or something, had something going on. There's a conflict of interest, isn't it? As a psychologist, you're interested in people and protecting them. I know you're not a psychologist, but this is about psychologists in this context. Conflict of interest, you're on the one hand you're working for the government, on the other hand you've got various professional codes that you yourself have to adhere to. So, believe it or not, in 2002 the American Psychological Association completely bent to the whim of the American government and said that if the conflict is unresolvable, psychologists may adhere to the requirements of the law, regulations or other governing bodies. So in fact, they were told to go ahead with whatever it is you do at Guantanamo Bay. Now the American Psychiatric Association never went that far, they stuck to their principles. In 2009, so very, very recently, the American Psychological Association backtracked, as they should, to say that torture is wholly unacceptable and inconsistent with membership of the American Psychological Association. So we're often under pressure not to do unethical things, all right? Now, the trouble is with understanding ethics in a research context is that in real life, people do so much worse things and do terrible things, right? Darren Brown, hypnotist, have you heard of him? Right, he hypnotised somebody into believing that he was an assassin whose target was Stephen Fry. Very nice, right? Well, there's another one actually. I can think of the Australian hoax phone call. Remember that? Yes? Right, I think it was that somebody, some Australian DJs rang a hospital, and it was about the birth of King, what's his name? George, yes. And the nurse who mistakenly, well actually, he was really bothered, she committed suicide, and there's probably something going on with her anyway. But, a terribly unethical thing to do. Big Brother, you must have heard of Big Brother, yeah? They do terrible things to people, yeah? We watch by CCTV all day long. How many times a day are you filmed us like 300 times something? Yes. So all those things are happening all the time, and now we are bound. You will be bound as researchers, especially if you're within the School of Psychology. But if you're doing research with human participants, you should be bound by the code of the British ethics code of the British Psychological Society. And I'll see if you can get it. Which is, well, it's very boring, obviously, but you have to be it's much more strict than anything that you would experience in real life, in fact. Can't find it, it's there. You can have a look at it. I can send you the link. And then turn there over. So we're bound by this code. And if you do anything that's remotely intrusive or invasive, then you'll be bound by other codes as well. So you might be bound by a code of, I'll put the NHS, the National Health Service, later. Anyway, things were not always as strict as they are now. And I'll come to what the kinds of things you need to consider when you run any kind of study with human organisms later. Now, have you all heard of Milgram's experiment? It's completely transcended psychology. Anybody not? No.
Was that one with prisoners?
No, that's the other pretty
Well,
famous one. It's
It's
the electric shocks one, yeah. Right, just to run over it briefly, because I'm getting a couple of nods here. Stan Milgram wanted to look at obedience and obedience to with authority, and he got some participants, i.e. members of the public, to administer, to train another person in another room into answering some questions. Right? Is that right? I can barely remember it. Right. Now, and if they got it wrong, they would administer an electric shock. This is the naive participant. This is the person who's doing the experiment, not the person who's doing the learning. The person who's doing the person who's administering the shocks is actually the subject or participant in this experiment. Doesn't realise that. He or she thinks that she's doing the experiment on the person in the other room. And what happens is, the more often they get it wrong, the higher, more powerful the electric shocks get, until you administer life-threatening electric shocks, and the person goes horribly silent in some cases, right? Now, of course, this isn't happening. The person who's having the electric shocks is a stooge, right? He's set up with the experiment. What Milgram found is that many people administered very high levels of electric shock, and so his conclusion was that people do obey authority, right? They do, and they will do what they're told. It's very worrying. Now, it's a famous experiment for many reasons. One of the reasons is that you would never get ethical clearance to do that now, right? For one thing. Probably wasn't such a thing as ethical clearance then. The participants in that experiment weren't protected from harm, because some of them experienced quite serious psychological after effects of realising what dreadful things they might do if they were told to do it. Their confidentiality was breached because you can see the film. There is film available. I guess if you go on YouTube, you can find some. There's film of it, and so we know who some of them were. There was talk of people committing suicide, but I think it's overblown. Quite a lot of the fallout from this experiment is actually urban myth, I think. But, now I'll be the only person probably ever to say but. We actually learned a great deal from it. So, some of the participants actually felt they learned something about themselves. The American Psychological Association, when they investigated them, concluded that it was actually ethically acceptable, and it was lauded as a great experiment. So, this is a very difficult one. Did the means, was it worth it? This is difficult. Where do you place where do you put the decision? Do you think about the people involved in the experiment? Do you think about what we learned from it? Where do you, you wouldn't allow it. If that came to ethics committee, I wouldn't allow it, right? Because you've got a duty of care towards the people themselves that are doing this study. Yeah? Okay. Yes?
I have a question.
Yes.
Because if we are not allowing that right now because we have this whole knowledge learned based on this experiment, that people can do that.
Yes.
Because if you are out of the blind, you're thinking like, come on, no one will go and do that. If we didn't have this knowledge that people actually follow it.
Yes, so what I'm saying is we learned so much from it that maybe it was acceptable.
Before that, we didn't know.
Well, I think that's right.
Probably everyone who is rational said that no, we will not do anything like this because they are rational. And what's the point?
Well, I think that's what the American Psychological Association thought. They thought that, well, we learned so much from this. Yeah, who cares about a few people? I mean, that's the issue, isn't it? Do we care about those few people or not? Right, here's another one. I love this experiment. This is just the worst. This is the worst study ever. This is fabulous. Right, I think this guy had another agenda, actually. He wanted to demonstrate that common prejudices about gay men were mistaken. I don't know what he meant by that quite. Anyway, what he did was he was in his own experiments, basically. First of all, he decided that he acted as a watch queen in a tea room, and he proved all that is, that as a man who stands outside the toilets while men are having sex inside, right? It's a much more glamorous role than it actually is. Anyway, so when the men came and went, he would note their license plate numbers, right? And then, I don't know how he found out their addresses, but from their license plate, I know, it's horrifying, isn't it? He found their addresses, he went to their house, posing as a social worker, right? And then went to their homes and found, as he expected, I guess, this is what he meant about common prejudices about them. Most of them had wives, right? And then he got just this one thing, he destroy their name. He doesn't know why he didn't get arrested for doing that, I don't know, right? This is the most unethical thing to do. He broke ethics, he probably broke the law once over again, yeah? So, I don't know what he was up to, but I hope he enjoyed it. Well, here's another one, it's not so, it's a little bit unethical, and this is a big ethical issue when you have, let's say for example, if you have a drug, and you really are convinced that it's going to make your worsening of your cancer much more slow, right? Who do you decide who to give the placebo to and who to give the real drug? Because if you think you're in the half a chance and you've got cancer, you're going to want that drug, aren't you? So it's a real big issue for people that do drug studies, because you've got to have a control group. Now, in this study, this is like an example of that, really. Children divided into two groups. One group was always praised, the other ones were told that their poor performance was due to their effort. Did this for about a month. What they found is after the group that were consistently praised actually didn't do very well, whereas the children who were told that if they tried harder they would do better, or that they weren't doing very well because they weren't trying hard enough, worked harder. So, you know, was that ethical to do that? Because what you've done is you've put some of the children at a disadvantage by doing this. And in a much more serious context, the same happens with drug tests. You put your control group at a disadvantage. Although, of course, placebos work quite well, as you'll know, even when you know that they're placebos. That's another can of worms, right? So these are all things where there are complex. Well, there aren't complex issues in the first one, because that's clearly you shouldn't be doing that. But there are complex issues when you decide to do something as to what the fallout will be. Now, the key principles of an ethical approach to research is always start from imagining it's you doing that study. Right? We used to call them subjects. We call them participants now, and that reflects what we think about them. They're not these things. They're not rats in a cage or participants. They're people like you, right? So they're doing you a favour. That's the first thing. They're doing you a favour. Imagine how you would feel if you are participating in your own study, and if you think, oh God, that's boring. Even boring for 2 hours is a bit unacceptable, right? I mean, if you're going to bore them in half-hour sections if you can, that's much kinder. Show them respect, give them autonomy, unless you have to, don't deceive them. Now, I know in some areas of psychology you have to deceive people. You protect them from harm as much as you possibly can. Confidentiality, that's a really difficult one actually, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Continuity of care, you don't get involved in any fallout from your experiment, but you point them in the right direction. We'll talk about all these in some detail in a minute. Also, look at your own competence and your own level of responsibility, because sometimes a study is acceptable if somebody with a great deal of expertise and knowledge does it, but might not be if a novice does it. And also your own protection, right? So, we have lone worker policies, for example. So let's look at these in a bit more detail. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about inclusivity and diversity, actually, at the end of this, because that's important too. Because when you want to do a PhD, you want to get your studies done as well and as soon as you want the best data you can get. That really kind of goes a bit against making sure that you include as many people with as many different origins and backgrounds, or let's say disabilities or any other problems, as you can. So it kind of goes against doing all the things, but you can't not do it. Right? Give people as much respect them as individuals, give them as much information as you can before the study starts. Now that's quite a difficult one, I'll talk about that in a minute. And it's also important that your participant can get out of it at any point. Now, in the Milgram experiments, you can see the power relationship. The experimenter is the person with the power. Yeah? So you've got to be very nice to your participants. You've got to make it so that they could literally get up and walk out and go through if they want to. Yeah? And they maintain power by having the right to withdraw and to not be deceived unless you absolutely have to. Now, informed consent, I'm going to talk about all of these now. The first thing, on the form, there is a form which you can find, right? There will be an ethics form. If you're in the process of designing experiments with human participants, you will have to apply for ethical clearance through the faculty. There's a portal, there's a page, there's forms. I'm not going to go through the form today because that's kind of an admin task. But one of the things will be, these will be the headings of the video to cover. Informed consent does not mean the participants sign a consent form. It does not mean that there's a consent form. What this is that you tell the participants enough about what you're going to do to allow them to consent to them doing it, so there are no surprises, right? Now, of course, you can't tell them everything about your study. You can't tell them absolutely everything, because otherwise, why would you bother? Yeah? If you could tell them everything and you already knew the outcome, there would be no point in doing it. Well, what you do is you set yourself the exercise of telling as much as you can without giving away what you think are the important things. So let's, for example, if it's a memory test, let's say you have a paradigm where you present numbers or letters and you just present them to the participant, and then you give them some kind of filler task, and then you go back and ask them to recall those letters or numbers. You don't need to tell them that's what they're going to do. You can just say you will be presented with some numbers. Yeah? Now what I do find sometimes is that because people want to conceal some part of their study, they decide to create a whole elaborate edifice of lies. And there's no need. You don't need to do that. Yeah? You don't need to provide a cover story. You just have to conceal the bits that you don't want to tell because it will bias the results. Yes? And usually looking at literature is useful because you'll be able to work out what you can tell them and what you can't. Or you can go straight to the research and ask them. So if it's a memory test, you don't want them to know that it's a memory test. But you can just say, I'm going to present you some numbers. Or, for example, if you're using a stooge in a social psychology experiment, so you've set up a person to react to the stimulus in some way or other, which you're hoping is going to influence the behaviour of the participant. Okay? So what you do is you present your experiment as being about something else, but something that's in the experiment. For example, if you want to look at people's compliance, you might want to see how they comply with a risk, which can't actually have a risk. Yeah? You have to concoct a risk. It looks like it's dangerous, but that's quite hard to make something look like it's dangerous when it isn't. You will be allowed to do that, provided you debrief your participants in full. We'll talk about that in a minute. And you allow them the right to withdraw their data. So, tell people as much as possible before you start the experiment. Don't surprise them. Yes? And as I said, use published literature to inform your decisions as to what you should tell them and what you shouldn't. This is quite often sometimes when we send ethics forms back to people, and it's because they've consumed more than they need to. Yeah? Deception is a very difficult one. Is anybody thinking that they might have to be involved in some deception? Okay. Right. Well, the key argument, right. If you were to do an experiment on something that we all know the answer to already that involves deception, you might not get ethical clearance for it. Because we don't like deception, but we understand the need to do it. Right? If we already know, why do that? The thing is, we don't really want to put people under any more pressure than is necessary, so why would you do it? If you've got good studies, presumably you're intending to do, then as long as you can justify the deception, that's fine, right? Because there are some areas where you just have to, because it defeats the whole point of the experiment. So particularly in social psychology, it's an issue. Sometimes you need to deceive people as to the true purpose of the study. So all of this is all right. Two things concern me about it, deception. Right, so because you can't give people informed consent if you're deceiving them. Yeah, you have to say this experiment is about X when actually it's about Y. Yeah. I've got two concerns, but more from a pragmatic point of view. The first one is, doesn't affect you as a researcher, but of course that's what people think psychology is. They go and do an experiment where they have to do a visual perception task and they think it's about something else, right? So people think psychology is about a secret thing that you won't tell them, right? So I think that's kind of, we've got a bit of our reputation there. The other thing is, as soon as you run one participant and debrief them, then all their friends will know. So that's, from your point of view, running an experiment is a bit difficult. Yeah? So especially if you use the pool of students that we've got. So people talk to one another, I imagine. Yeah? Now, debrief. So all those sections on the form, debrief. You should tell your participant everything you can about the study. Yeah, this study was, and you would submit these. You would submit your brief and your debrief with your application, as well as the various ethical things. You should inform them what the purpose of the study was. You should tell them everything you can about it. In the case of the one involving deception, it's a bit difficult, but we can talk about that. I always ask if they have any questions. Yes, about the experiment. Like, what's your favourite colour? Joking. Right? You should let them leave in the same condition as they arrived. Yeah? Only like an hour older. Right? Your job is to ensure that anything that happened in the experiment is correct in the debrief. That's quite a challenge. So, for example, are you going to change their mood? In particular, are you going to change it from a good one to a bad one? You can, with various. If you do that, we'll want to see what you're going to use to change that mood. So it might be not very nice images or something that's going to depress, something like that. You need to somehow put it right. Right? That's very naive that you can. But for example, you might show them some cartoons or that kind of thing. Yeah? Sometimes, of course, you can open a complete can of worms depending on what kind of study you do. Right?
What happens if you change it from a bad to a good? Do you ever change it back to a bad again?
Yeah. Sometimes things happen during experiments that you, let's say, so I think two examples. One is where you're looking at their, let's say you're doing physiological things, and you're measuring the heart rate, and you discover that their heart rate is very irregular, and they don't know this. Or you test their hearing and you realise that's obviously more serious. You test their hearing and you realise you've got big holes in their hearing. They don't know this. It's not your job to tell them. It's your job to refer them. You might say something vague, like, oh, or, you know, tell them to go to the GP, yeah? Or something like that. I'm not quite sure how you resolve that, but sometimes you do uncover things that surprise both you and them. Protection from harm. A risk assessment. Now, have you ever done a risk assessment? Okay, well, it's quite simple. There is a form for it. Anthony, the technical manager, he will have a form for risk assessment and give you some guidance, but there's no magic to it. You just go around and make sure that the thing is safe, and you look at the likelihood that something's going to happen, and you look at the risk, and mostly the risk is about tripping over computer cables. Right? But there might be other risks. I mean, if you're using elaborate equipment, especially if you're using TMS, it will be a huge risk assessment, which is already done. What you find in general is the more severe the intervention, the more likely a proper risk assessment has been done, and likely that the people that do it, like your supervisors, will be very good at knowing how to get ethical clearance. It's sometimes the sort of more simple studies with computers and screens that don't get proper risk assessment. Possible sources of harm, there are more than you think. Now, what will happen? What will you do if something happens that you weren't expecting? And I said, like, if you uncover what looks like a bit of an old heart trace or something like that, just refer them to the GP. Say perhaps they might think about going to see their GP using their heart, having an ECG or something. Sometimes, if you're doing more clinical things, you're looking at life events or things like that, you can open a can of worms, in which case you refer people to, have the number of a counsellor to hand. Don't you interfere. Yes, we're not trying to do this, right? You just refer them on. So if there's a questionnaire that asks anything that's remotely personal and might evoke something that you didn't really want, then, well, you do want to study, but you don't care that much, you know? You know what I mean? For the research purposes, you want to know, but you don't, you know. The individual you don't want to have to deal with, right? You refer them, just say, this is the number of accounts, and leave it to them to do the phoning, or the going to the counsellor's group. Okay? Possible sources of physical harm. The physical risks, first of all, so things like some of you will be involved with using quite heavy equipment, so you'll, somebody will have already done a risk assessment, but you should find out, you should look at it, you should get hold of it and look at it. So electrodes, things like that. Any task that involves any kind of pain or exercise, right, so if you do something like that, then you should ensure that the first aider, the departmental first aider is available. And one of our technicians, Lynn, is our first aider. So you shouldn't do anything if she's not here. Yeah? If you do anything more like that, then you would need to get it past ethics first. And if there wasn't, we are actually just about to, I think we're going to up our insurance because we're doing that sort of tougher and tougher stuff to people, and we need to make sure that our insurance covers us. Well, even things like fatigue. Don't expect your participant to stare at the computer screen for 2 hours pressing buttons, because you won't get very good data from anything else. Now, allow them to break either every 15 minutes or when they want to, or something. And the brightness and the loudness of the stimuli. So if you're playing these over headphones, make sure that you don't play them too loud. British Psychological Society has a limit of 90 decibels out the ear. I think it might be reduced to 85, so please be careful of that as well. And then the psychological risks. If you're doing anything of sensitive nature, you have to judge that. Are you going to change their mood? Are you going to deceive them? These are all things you need to be thinking about when you set your study up. So if there are any of this, you need to really think about what you're doing, and you shouldn't be gung-ho about this. You should be the opposite of gung-ho, whatever that might be. These precious flowers we're doing studies on here, very clever with them. If there are any risks, you need to minimise them. It's as simple as that, really. Yeah? You need to debrief them in such a way as to minimise anything that you've done in the study. So, for example, if you do a thing where you, I have a particular problem with things where you make people think they're doing something that they're not, like they're getting answers right when they're getting it wrong, or they're getting them wrong when they're getting them right, or you're telling them they've got terrible personality, that kind of thing. You need to be very careful with those kind of things. But if you find yourself doing that, you need to think and talk to your supervisor about how to minimise the effects of these. I know that worse things happen in real life, but the point is this is voluntary. This is not real life, right? This is people doing things above and beyond real life. Yes? You also need to allow participants the right to withdraw either during the experiment, right? So they can walk. It's very difficult for them. So you need to be nice to them so that you emphasise at any point you can withdraw from this study. Obviously, you can't use the data. So if they want to be halfway through because they've got a headache, or they don't like the experiment, or they don't like you, or something like that, let them go. Write it off. Right? They can also withdraw their data after the experiment. Right? So, and there are plenty of reasons for doing that. Obviously, there's a limit as to how long after your study they can withdraw their, a week after it's published in the Psychological Bulletin, one of your participants wants to withdraw their data. That's a bit too late, right? You can give them a deadline. You can say you can withdraw your data at any point up to 2 weeks in the future, a month in the future, right? Then you can just take it out and get rid of it, right?
Sorry, what's the reasoning behind that one? Why is that? What is the reasoning behind taking it?
Well, I was going to say, it doesn't appear to be here. The reason being that, for example, if they've done a whole experiment where they're deceived, and then at the end of the experiment you tell them that there was a deception, and they go, oh, well, if I realised that, I wouldn't participate in this experiment. Yeah? Or they might not they might have their own ethical objection to what you're doing. Yeah? So they might just object to what you're doing inside. Yeah. It's because it's usually when you haven't given them enough information to go on. Yeah, people don't do it very often, certainly not after. Or they may have given you some personal information and they decide they want to withdraw it. Well, actually, they don't want you to know that. Right? Now, there's the duty of care thing, but the duty of care is not to look after them yourself, but to refer them on. Yeah? It's always, if it's a medical thing, tell them to get in touch with the GP. If it's a psychological thing, if you've stirred up some unhelpful memory and they realise that they need to get some counselling, give them the name of a counsellor, but don't get involved with them. You always give them a contact address for you, or and the person in charge of the administrator in charge of ethics in the faculty. If they've got any queries in general about the experiments, right? So you can debrief them, then they might want to know more, so they might come back to you and ask you. They very rarely do that. What you don't want them to do is come back to you saying, oh, that experiment really upset me, I had bad dreams. Go and talk to your GP or go and talk to a counsellor. Yeah? Anonymity. This is a very difficult one. Yeah? Because, participants should be as anonymous as you can make it. You know, again, it's like with informed consent. Tell them as much as you can without ruining your experiment. Give them as much anonymity as you can without actually losing track of who's who. Yeah? So, for example, when you're running your experiment, you might just give them a participant number. If it's an experiment, just one session, you just give them a number. Let's say if it's a vision experiment, you don't need to know anything about them. Just run the experiment, participant number. As long as you can match the number to the data, that's all you need. Sometimes you do need their name. Let's say, for example, where they have to come back. Well, you can still do it by number, but you might need their name. But what you should do is destroy the connection between their name and the data you've got for them at the earliest opportunity. That's actually the Data Protection Act. Right? We have two conflicting things here. On the one hand, journals and various data management organisations, like research councils, are requiring that you hold on to your data for longer and longer. On the other hand, the Data Protection Act is saying that anything you've got that identifies an individual, you need to get rid of. So what you've got to do is hold on to your data, but sever the link, right, with the person. The only problem that comes, of course, that if one of those people decides they want to withdraw their data and you've already severed the link, you know who they are. So that's why it's important to coordinate this. Yeah. If you've got video data, you should pixelate the faces. Yeah. Even the BBC, even those TV cop programs do that, don't they? The poor innocent, not the drunken person, but the innocent bystander. Not the way watch it. So, do it by numbers. As far as you can, try not to identify individuals through their name. It doesn't matter so much, obviously, with data that's conceptual data, but if it's, if it's questionnaire stuff that's a bit sensitive, you do need to be careful about that. Now, confidentiality. You should keep the data that you collect is between you and your supervisor. Right? It's not for anybody or your research team or something, not anybody else. You can't completely guarantee confidentiality. What, for example, if you were doing a study where you asked people about some aspect of their lives, and they revealed to you that at one point in the past they'd murdered someone. Yeah? You have to break confidentiality when you do things like that. It's not a golden rule, but people think it is. Obviously, use your brains about it. It's very unlikely that. It's very, very unlikely that you will ever have to break confidentiality, but you would know when you had to. Yeah? Yeah? It is very important to not to laugh about your participants with your friends, I think, for example. And it's quite tempting, isn't it? But some of you will be teaching students, you can laugh about them. Because they're much funnier. Right, so confidentiality is pretty much an absolute, but not quite an absolute, right? And the right to withdraw. So, as I've labelled this point quite a lot, they can, right, I've said all this before. It's a difficult one for you, because if somebody wants to withdraw after having produced lovely data, you have to ditch the data and give them whatever reward they're going to get for participation. But that's life, I'm afraid. Yeah? Sometimes you can be on this path of I just want to get my studies done. You can be very, I mean, we want you to be like that, but equally, you've got to be like human beings. Right? If people don't want to, then you must give them the right. If it was you and you wanted your data withdrawn, you would want people to grant that right. Okay? And yes, this is the. These are the reasons why people might want their data withdrawn. Well, let's say deception, or if you can properly brief them or debrief them. If they left a bit confused about what your experiment was and felt a bit funny, they might, if you change their mood for example, and you haven't really explained why, they might feel they want their data withdrawn, or they might not like your study in principle. Or another reason is they get terribly badly on your task, and they're just a bit embarrassed. Yeah? Those kinds of things. But it's very difficult for students for participants to exercise that right. Okay. Right, if you're anybody planning to do studies with children? Yes? You have to get the Criminal Records Bureau checked. I'm not sure what the rule will be if yes, because you won't be, if you're not a UK national, I'm not quite sure how that will happen, but we'll work that out.
It works the same way.
Is it the same? Oh,
Yeah, it might just take longer.
okay. You have to do a Criminal Records Bureau check, and you have to get consent from the schools, or wherever you're going to do your studies. Yeah? Now, if they're 16 to 18, it's a bit more relaxed. If they're under 16, then you need a full CRB check. Although the rules on CRB checks are actually changing. If you're only going a couple of times, you may not need one. Yeah? But there's a website. If you look on the .gov, the UK government websites, they'll tell you they're quite up to date on this kind of thing. You also should obtain consent from parents. So this is where the desire to run your research really gets in the way of doing it right, or the most correct way. Because we prefer opt-in, all right, which means that you get active consent from the parents. So you send a letter home, all right, and it comes back. This is in a very optimistic world, right? It comes back. The parents signed it, so yes, my child will be in your study. Because what happens is it gets chucked in the school bag. He never comes back. Yes, yes. We know how that happens, but that's why we prefer opt-out, where you send a letter home. If you don't reply, we'll assume your child will take part in our study. Right? Now, we will allow opt-out, but we much prefer opt-in because they give an active consent. Yeah? Yeah? And you should try to get consent of the children too. Well, Michaela will know how to do this. Michaela will always do this. Now, what we're not entirely clear about, and you're, again, Michaela, that everybody, but not all of you, are in the Faculty of Health and Human Sciences. Presumably you're in the faculty of which school your supervisor's in. So if you're in arts, you probably should be going to the arts. Ethics. Each faculty has an ethics committee. Some of you might be confusing. What?
Well, most of us are between.
Yes.
Both.
Yes. Well, I think we should do with the directors, or I think I'll discuss it with Sue. You probably should all come through the Faculty of Human Sciences, actually, just so we know. I think that's just a thing that we can sort out. Yeah. You submit a project proposal, which you write stuff about what your study's about, and it asks you about informed consent. It asks you about protection from harm, and all the things I've been through. It asks you all those questions and how you will do those things. It also asks you about whether you will have children in it or vulnerable adults. Right? You might have vulnerable adults. Now, that could be any number of types of persons. Yes, it might be people with a clinical disorder. It might be people with learning difficulties, any number of things, but the important thing is whether they are able to give consent or not, or that somebody can give consent for them. We look at your proposal, and there are 4 or 5 of us on the committee, and we look at those headings to see if you haven't told us enough about your study, we'll come back to you and say we need to know more. We can't give approval unless we can really see what it is you're going to do. And you should attach your brief and your debrief and any other things that, if you're going to deceive people, we want to know extra about that. Yeah? And then we would typically make a decision which was either that we clear it for, if we give you ethical approval, that means usually for the project, depending on how much you change it. So it might be for your whole PhD project, unless you make significant changes during it. Or that we prove it's subject to you making some modifications, yeah?
Are there specific deadlines for...
No.
So you approve them or anyway consider them at all time all year?
Yeah, we tend to take 2 weeks over it. We can be quicker. Yeah, except in the summer, I wouldn't try it in August. Yeah? Right. Sometimes we ask you to resubmit, but we'd say what we didn't like about it. Occasionally we reject something, right? And it's in your interest that you're absolutely clear about what you're going to do, especially if it looks a bit dodgy, right? Because you don't want to get into trouble by doing something where you upset somebody, because you can get into trouble, not you, the whole university. Yeah, I've seen some instances. Very rarely do we reject something outright. And it really shouldn't get that far. You shouldn't be planning to do a thing if your supervisors will have done something like it before, and they already have ethical approval, so it's unlikely you can do something that's really outrageous. Any questions on that? Any questions? No?
Yeah, I have 2 questions actually. So, first of all, it happened to me last year, so I video recorded some people to collect some data, and I had all the consent, ethics approved and everything. But then after a few months, like after I had finished and conducted the study, one of my recorded people asked me if he could have the video of himself in the studio. And I didn't know what to do. I mean, I said no, but what was I supposed to do?
You said no?
Himself, yeah. It was just himself. But you could hear the voice of the other person, whatever. I didn't know.
Well, there were other people in it, weren't there? Were there other people in it?
No, the video was just of his face, but you could hear the other person.
Or you said no?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you're entitled to say no. I think you're entitled to say no, but I think it would have better to say yes. Michaela, you've got a view on that. Do people ever ask for videos of their children?
No, they don't ask of videos of their children, but they often ask, especially if you do an ability test, how did my child do?
Oh, yeah.
And as far as I know, you're not allowed to tell parents. You just say the overall mean was that, this was the distribution, most children fall this and that, but you're not allowed to give parents the information about that particular child. Because supposedly, I mean, you cannot make that link anyway, right? It's anonymous even to yourself. So that happens very often with the child participants. Now in that case, I wouldn't allow discipline either.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Especially if you are making, you're testing people like that, usually has to be even like not children, but if you are testing students, they also want. But the thing is that even if you are using psychometrical tests, you are using that in test environment, so we cannot predict anything. In fact, those have kind of manipulation.
Yeah.
So we are not allowed to really keep something.
She's doing the right thing. I just add that we want you to do your studies. We're not a little secret little thing trying to stop you from doing your studies. I mean, we want you to do your studies, but we've got to think about the university too. So the university can't do anything that will put it into disrepute, yes? Or that we're not insured for. I mean, it depends how good our lawyers are as well. Yes? Right, now I want to make you think about this as well.
Judy doesn't know.
Yeah, sorry, I had another one.
Oh yeah, so you did, yeah.
Sorry. So, okay, so your participants are allowed to withdraw their data at any time. What if the participant comes in an altered state, you know you're not going to use their data because you know they're not going to perform
Yes.
as you wish or whatever.
Yeah.
And I know that you still have to pay them, but can you just, you know, if they're coming drunk or whatever, can't you just dismiss them and not pay them?
Yes.
You can.
Well, yeah, you're going to send them away with the money.
Or you have to pay them still.
Oh, no, I think you do actually.
No, if they come drunk, you say?
Yeah, some people do that happens.
No,
when you pay participants.
Well, I think you could, yes, I think you might say.
But you
could
can
say
do that. If you think that you noticed that before starting.
Or for example, if you specifically ask for, I don't know, left-handed people and a right-handed person come in.
Oh, no, yeah, you're trying to go away, yes.
But it depends if you started with a task or not. So
Yeah. I guess so. I guess if you haven't started them, you can send them away without payment, but if you started them, then you realise, especially starting complete, and then just get rid of their data.
So if you have any valid reasons to believe that participant is not going to be useful to your research, you can dismiss them before starting.
Yeah, but you need to be very careful about that. That's what I'm going to talk about next. Yes? I would be all for testing everyone and then ditching the data if you have to. Right? I will talk about, now strictly, equality and diversity doesn't apply to research, but it's good practice to do so. I'm going to talk about this, because I do have a big worry that people don't run their experiments in such ways to be inclusive. Right? I think it's actually quite an important thing. Now I'm going to talk about it just from the point of view of employment, first of all. There's a great big act in the UK, called the Equality Act, and it brought together all the things like disability and discrimination, age, gender, all that stuff into one big act. It's called the Equality Act. This is the woman, Harriet Harman, who people using this. She's our Labour MP. She was one of these, actually called it, there she is. Now, this is very important law in the state. No, it's not law for you, but I'm telling you this in terms of your practices. Right, now, there are some, now equality, very old. People talk about equality, but actually, it's called, we call it E&D, right? Equality and diversity. Equality is actually a bit of a misnomer. It's about difference. It's not about treating people as equal. It's treating people in such a way as you give them the same opportunity to do something, right? Which means treat them differently. Now you should think about this when you do your studies, right? Because you need this very rigid kind of paradigm. I must do the same for all my participants. Must. What if there's someone dyslexic? You might, for example, just a very simple modification, read the instruction at them rather than get them to look at them, for example. Right? Now it's very important that you do this because actually you'll get, psychology is supposed to be about people. It's not about a particular type of person, right? And companies benefit. The most inclusive companies do better, right? I went to Atlanta in 2012. I went to some of the sites. I went to the Martin Luther King, whatever it's called, museum, right? But there I learnt about history, really. Where I learnt about equality was at the World of Coca-Cola, because their employment practice is superb. I mean, 20 people working there. There was a woman over 70, there was Hispanic people, there were black people, there were white people, there were disabled people. It's brilliant. Coca-Cola is a brilliant company. Companies that do that run better. It's just the data shows that they do. So, but also, if you're doing experiments on people, make sure they are people, not very specific, narrow band of people. So it's a cornerstone of good practice here. So these are the protected characteristics. Two of them are subsumed. So pregnancy, maternity, and marriage and civil partnership kind of subsumed into sex. These are the ones. You can't discriminate against people on the basis of any of these things legally. Now, it's not legal for you, but it's about, think about how you can run your experiments so as not to, perhaps by accident, push one or two groups out of your study, right? Now, if the population of the world was 100 people, that would be how it would look, right? The trouble is that when we do psychology experiments, we almost exclusively test one very small group. Right, so is psychology the study of the white middle class 20-year-old female? It shouldn't be, right? So you want to think about this. Do you want your data to apply to all people, or just... Well, I know people think, if they conduct a very rigorous experiment with everything controlled, we've kind of overtaken the life out of it, really. Yeah? The editor of the Psychological Bulletin may not agree with me. But things have to change. Things actually are slowly changing, especially in applied areas. Because if you want to demonstrate something, editors of journals would want you to demonstrate with a wide range of people, not just on the 20-year-old woman. So this is really my point, is that in employment you have to, you can place restrictions on who you recruit for your studies, but you have to think about why you're doing that, right? Employers can discriminate, but they have to have a good reason, yeah? When you think about how you're going to recruit participants, think about the same things. So, for example, if you decide that you only want to test women, well, there are some experiments, obviously you need to only test women. So I'll give you an example of one there. If you're interested in the effects of childcare on academic performance, don't just test women, because men are involved in childcare too. But if you really are genuinely interested in only the effects of childcare on academic performance in women, then you can test women, right? Here's another one. The trouble is, by being inclusive, you tend to get more messy data. And of course we don't like that. We want nice, clear, uniform data, but that's not really what people do. So, you decide you want to restrict people over the age of 55. Now, people's reaction times get slower as they get older. That's not good enough reason to restrict them. You can do much when you're too slow, right? Can't do that. You want to do a listening experiment, and you know that hearing tends to fall off over 55. Well, that's not really a good enough reason to do it either. Now, if you're collecting data in age bands, you've already got your data for people over 55 or don't want it, yes, then you recruit people under 55 only. But sometimes people do this, they exclude people because they're going to get nicer data, and you can't do that. Yeah? Now this one will apply to some of you, and I don't know how to resolve this, but you might be ahead of me here. Now, you're doing a study where you want to, you're asking for native English speakers. Right, I don't even know what that means. What does it mean to be a native English speaker? Does it mean the language you first learned? What does it mean? I mean, yeah, well, many people, when they're doing, at work, English is their first language, isn't it? Right, so what does it mean to say you want a native speaker of English? Right?
I always say it has to be when they learn it in the critical period.
Is that what you do?
Yeah.
But why do you have to have it? Is it because of brain organisation?
Yeah.
Is it? You don't know anything? This is what you think about it. Now, what is it that you really want? Do you really want somebody who just speaks English well enough to do your study? Right? In which case, find out what that level is, because there are lots of English qualifications. Many of you will have them. Yeah? And say, I want TEFL, there is level X and above. Yeah? Because it discriminates. I mean, especially in this group. Yeah? Yeah?
I just want to go back to the age thing. Pretty much all the testing I've done here has been age range 18 to 35.
Yeah.
You're saying you can't do it, but they
Well, you can do it if you want.
No, for experimental reason, there's no any kind of any.
If there are actually people older, that doesn't matter. What I'm saying is you've had a great cohort of people over 55, then test them.
If you want to diagnose, there's a problem, but for experimental reason, there's no problem.
I just wondered if there was any law that said.
I'm just saying be inclusive.
Yeah.
But if your experiment doesn't really require you to be a native speaker of English or critical, if it just requires you to have, if it's because of brain organisation, it's somehow different, then that's good. Then you're doing brain scan. That's a good reason.
Yeah.
But if you're not, if it's just about having a particular level of spoken English, then put it at that. Yeah.
How specific do you have to be? Can you just say sort of proficient use of English language skills? Can you say something?
It's up to you. I mean, I think the more inclusive you can be, the better. But if you obviously don't want to mess up your data. You know, if it means that people do something quite different.
Yeah.
But I think it's getting harder and harder to be very specific about. I want native speakers of English. Because everybody speaks English.
Yeah, but that's why I think it's just safer for you to select native English speakers, because then you eliminate the risk of having someone not understanding the, for example, any task that you ask them,
Yes.
and bringing your data. So that's why I think
Yes.
you should ask for native.
But then I'll exclude so many people.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, well that's my objection.
And that's also why, I don't know, if you're testing just a sample of the population, you're going to be specific in your paper about who you tested. Otherwise, you have 30 participants who are speaking English but were born in 30 different countries.
Yes.
You have to specify all these things.
Yes.
And it can be due to so many things that their performance in the experiment, due to their first language or second language or whatever.
Yes.
So, I don't know, I would always have to coordinate with these speakers.
Especially like for your experiment when the hearing is very important.
Yeah, yeah.
If you're a show of phonemes,
Yeah.
it's the kind of thing which is development.
I guess it's heavily dependent on your theory and your subject area.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
If it's a standard like this.
That's what I'm saying here, yeah.
Yeah, if it's a decision-making thing, and you
Yes.
don't think it
Yes.
affects it,
If it doesn't, if it isn't about language,
Yeah.
just about something else, then you don't. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, you can test, for example, that they understand what task you want them to do. I don't know, you can like brief them before or something. So, but if you can't do that for whatever reason, then I think you have to be absolutely sure that they understand that you don't risk, waiting, or that your research is biased because they don't understand.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand that you could. And of course, the trouble is, all the previous research will have done that. So it's built up to move. It's not the whole thing is can be described as people use it as it's like trying to turn a line of a teaspoon. You know?
It's a more general question, but if we allow the more diverse to the participants, if they will have a control group, and the more diverse the participants, the more things there are that are difficult to control.
Yes.
So you have two very homogeneous groups and you just...
Well, you can match them, can't you? You can match them. You can match them.
Yes, can we? Because then if we have, I mean, we're going to have age and we're going to have only one or two participants that
Yes.
are much older or
Right.
much younger.
Well, you can be right. You're right. You can have a well, right. You can have a small group of one. But why, instead of having native speakers of English, why not have all native Spanish speakers who have X level of facility with English?
It's just easier to recruit English participants in England. If you were in Spain, you would recruit native Spanish.
But I suppose, I guess the question is, I mean, not necessarily about your studies, but this excludes about half of us in Sweden.
Yeah, that's what I was just
I mean, do you run experiments that you yourself couldn't participate in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know it's children, but you would. So you'd run experiments that you can't participate in.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah, but that's, yeah.
Yeah, but you need to. Well, yeah.
I think it's different.
If you absolutely need to, that's fine. But I'm saying that people, for example, I'm getting another example was, let's say that a minute. No. For example, you have a right. Let's say you do a fraction time task and you've got your keyboard set up and you want the participant to you put the mouse. Let's say you put the mouse here. So just with someone with the mouse. You've got it all nicely set up for a right-handed person, right? And you advertise it only right-handed people. Not because it can't be done by left-handed people, because you set up and it's an inconvenience to you to move to do that. Alright? That's what I'm talking about. There's an issue of proportionality which I'm going to come to later. If it's too much trouble, if it really, really is too much trouble, then you don't have to do it. You don't have to do any of these things. I'm just trying to get you to think about being a bit more inclusive. Because, for example, in our participation pool, we have some participants we can barely find the experiment to do because they're excluded for so many different reasons. We should think about it. Because if you have to exclude all these people, what is your research about? Who is it about?
So I suppose you're just, the point that you're trying to bring across, that it's a trade-off.
Yes.
You can get a very specific group and you know that it's more tightly controlled, but to what extent is it generalizable and therefore useful?
Yeah, yes, that'd be more right. This just needs to be think about. So, if your thing is about a particular topic, you can be as specific as you like, all right? You can look at ethnic minorities, you can gay people, older people. If you want to, outside the protected characteristics, you can do whatever you want. If you want to do a study on bird eyes, that's entirely up to you, right? But you can do all these things. But I just want you to think about. So, for example, if you only hold if you do your studies in the evening, who are you excluding by doing that? You're excluding people with children from start. Yeah? Just, if you hold it in a place where access is difficult, right, then that will be a problem for disabled people, especially people with seen disabilities. Of course, bear in mind that there are lots of unseen disabilities too, like diabetes, heart problems, all sorts of things like that. You can work that's right, 30% of people, was it what was the percentage? Some high percentage of people have disabilities of one sort or another. Now, in employment, you have to make reasonable adjustments for protected characteristics, but you do the same for your study. Are you going to do the same for yours? So can you, for example, if you've got, can your study be done by a blind person, let's say? Can you change your study in such a way as to collect meaningful data from a blind person? Yeah? Correct? It might be, but it's utterly pointless. Yeah?
It's not that simple to do that.
Yeah.
Because people, for example, from a psychological point of view, you want to have normal people who develop like typical.
Yes, yes. It may be that asking a blind person, especially a person who's blind about visual objects, is just pointless because they've got no, or asking a deaf person about auditory objects might be pointless. Yeah.
But you still got a lot of confounding variables, like you don't know how, if he was born blind, you don't know how he developed his attention.
Yeah, and I appreciate that.
So
so that you may not be able to, but if it's word learning, let's say you can have visual words on a screen, is there a reason not to do the same thing auditorily with a blind person?
maybe not.
You'd have to be able to defend it though. Yes? But the top one would be, if you've got a dyslexic participant, you should read out the instructions instead of getting them to read it because they will understand them better. Or you might struggle to read them visually, just a bit tense. It might be that some people take more time than others, so if you've got a strict time, especially let's say people get a bit slow as they get older. What about questionnaires? Questionnaires often are questions that are a bit outmoded, outdated. They make assumptions about people. Or not all disabilities, but left-handers, they're not protected, but left-handers often get a ordeal. Yeah? They get left out of lots of studies. Now, do you want your data set to be completely devoid of left-handers? Do you really want your research to be only about the 20-year-old white, middle-class, female, right-handed girl? Do you really? Yeah? I mean, the trouble is that, you might have all the rest of psychology, so mine should be as well. Now, proportionality is always defensible. That is, you say, it's too much trouble, it's not worth it, employers can do this, so you can do it too. So I don't really want to adjust my experiment for the visually impaired or blind because it's very difficult to transcribe it, and also, I'm not sure, what you were just saying just now, that the results I get will be meaningful. But you should at least think about it. Yeah? I wasn't trying to get you to think about it. I know that you'd all go away with exactly what you want to do, but the point is you should think about who you're cutting out when you do things a certain way, and whether it's for your benefit or their benefit. Yeah? Despite a lot of the time it's for your benefit. Yeah? I think that's it. No? Now, if you're, the final thing I'm going to say is we have an ethical procedure within the university, but if you want to do anything that's remotely medical or involves people in their humans, the general public, in the context of as patients and GPs or as hospital attendants, you will need to get clearance from the National Health Authority, the National Health Service, which is a whole different kind of fish. You have to, but there is, it takes longer to get clearance for this, and the form is more elaborate, but you will have to get it. And you'll know, when the time comes, you'll know what is going on. We do have people that can advise you whether you will need it or not. And if you were to come to me, I would let you know whether we think you need to apply for the NHS clearance or not. What we would make you apply for university clearance as well as NHS, what we would do is look at your NHS application, see if we thought there were any issues with it before it went off. Yeah? So you would have to do it twice, because that would be a good pain. But it used to be a very lengthy process. It would take like something 6 months to get the response, but it doesn't take that long now. It's much more streamlined. The guidance on what kinds of studies need clearance from the NHS is kind of shifting. It used to be you needed clearance to do studies on medical people, clinicians themselves, but we don't now. So if you want to do a study on doctors or nurses, you don't need to get periods anymore. You used to have to. Right, if you want to look at, I've got a thing that you might want to look at. It's just some scenarios about recruiting participants. Let's look at them, just think about the answers to them. Put your hands around. And that's it. If you want to ask any questions afterwards, that's fine. I'm done for now. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you do anything too risky, but I think that when people do studies, they don't think enough about only looking at one very narrow band of societies. And I know that everybody else is going to publish stats, and it's going to be very difficult to shift the momentum, but we should be trying. And as a Marie Curie project, where E&D is very important, we shouldn't think enough. Because, for example, we had to meet a certain criteria for the gender structure of the fellowship staff. These things are important. They thought about you, so you